So yes, Jerry and I did kill the projector. It seemed like such a good idea. We changed the bulb out, it'd be brighter, everything would be great, and now it's really dim. So we're going to have to get a new one, but it'll be in, and we should have it by next Sunday. So happy Mother's Day to all of you that are mothers, and everybody else, I guess, too, but especially to those of you who are mothers. My own mother is here with us today, as she usually is on Sundays. Or sorry, not on Sundays, on Mother's Day. Not every Sunday. I'm not hallucinating, I promise. So, yeah, it would. A little long drive, though. Although I guess you guys made it going the other way for quite a long time, going down to the valley. So happy Mother's Day. I want to start, Steve, I got to tell you, that was a really cool Lord's Supper message. I did not realize how thick the curtain was, and I love that phrase. It would have taken an act of God to cut it open, because it takes an act of God to split the veil of sin and make it possible for us to have that relationship, and that is just really cool. That's a fantastic idea, so thank you for that. And I appreciate Mark as well for being the guy to get up with glasses on, having to read from the actual songbook, which it's been a while. And I'm kind of in the same boat myself in terms of not having a PowerPoint behind me. I'm so used to doing this. It's been a long time since I preached regularly without a PowerPoint. In fact, really goes back almost to when I was preaching kind of just as a fill-in Tucson at the church where I served as a part-time youth minister. And back then, I had these little yellow pads, and I would make my sermon notes on these little yellow pads, and I could put the little sheets inside my Bible and go up there and read from them. And I realized if I did that today, I wouldn't be able to read anything because they're too small now, because I need the glasses as well. So fortunately, I got nice big words on the screen here. So today I'm supposed to preach a Mother's Day sermon, because that's what Sue told me. I had a different idea, and she said, I think people were expecting a Mother's Day sermon. And I said, all right, I'll do that. So, but I didn't really have a good Mother's Day sermon. The only rule I have is I'm not supposed to preach a Mother's Day sermon out of Proverbs 31. My mom's shaking her head because she really pounded that into my head when I was a little kid, even before I was remotely considering being a preacher. You go to church and the preacher get up there and preach a sermon about that woman of noble character who's the superhuman woman that doesn't exist in real life that the proverb writer talks about. He may have been the wisest man in the world, but he was dumb to say that out loud. So he comes up with all this stuff, and then you get a preacher who gets up and tells all the women in the congregation why they aren't doing enough because they aren't doing all those things. So I'm not going to do that.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I would hear no end of it if we went to lunch afterwards, so it's for my benefit as well. So instead, I was looking and I came up with another story, a story, I should say, as opposed to a proverb, and it's one that we're all super familiar with. In fact, if I didn't have it on the screen here, I still wouldn't need to have my Bible to tell the story, because we all know how this story goes and what it's about. But to understand the background of the story, we have to go back into the distant past before the nation of Israel was the nation of Israel. They were just the children of Israel in Egypt. So Israel, the nation of Israel, become the nation of Israel, went to Egypt out of Canaan after a famine, or during a famine, when Joseph, the son of Israel, or of Jacob, invited them there after becoming very, very powerful in the land of Egypt. And having been owed a great debt by the Pharaoh, whose nation he had helped save through his prophetic wisdom given to him by God. And so Jacob and his family, 70 people, come down to Egypt, and they take up residence in the land of Goshen, which is a good place to raise sheep, because the Egyptians do not like sheep. And so it's kind of like, you just go over there, raise the sheep, stay out of our way. And so 400 years pass, and at some point along in those 400 years, probably towards the end of those 400 years, the Bible says a new Pharaoh came up who did not remember Joseph. And I don't think that means he literally didn't remember Joseph. I think that he didn't prioritize what Joseph had done. And because of that Pharaoh starts to get nervous, because the Israelites have just been getting more and more numerous, just growing and growing and getting more and more strong. And here they are, basically what could almost be viewed as a potential invasion force already inside of Egypt. At this time, Egypt is the greatest nation, the greatest empire in the world. And most empires that are really, really powerful, their bigger threats come from inside rather than outside. And so the Pharaoh is, understandably perhaps from a human wisdom standpoint, a little nervous about this. And so he decides that it's time to slow down the growth. So in Exodus chapter 1, let's see, this probably works better if I turn it on. Okay, so in Exodus chapter 1, it says, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it's a daughter, then he shall live. Now, this would normally be called infanticide, except that because what he's trying to do is to eliminate all of one group of, or one side of the breeding equation, it's actually genocide. It's genocide to try to wipe out a culture by making it impossible for them to have children, and that's what he's trying to do. So this is what he says: you're helping them to give birth. If it's a son, kill it. If it's a girl, fine. But the midwives, it says, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called to the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. This is a situation where you can tell a lie to someone who has no idea what you're talking about a lot more easily than you can someone who doesn't. And I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on here. Now, I also really have very little knowledge about this, although I'm aware of the statistics, but I'm pretty sure they're making that up. So the Pharaoh goes, all right, I guess okay, so he goes on. So the Pharaoh says God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. And again, this is only reinforcing what Pharaoh's concerned about. Now, we don't know how long this process took, but the scriptures say because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. So Pharaoh falls back on plan B, and he commands all his people, saying, every son who is born, and he means to the Israelites, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So basically he tells all the Egyptians, watch out, if you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw him into the Nile. Just take care of it that way. So it's not just the midwives, it's everybody in Egypt is now part of this policing process. And you might think that if you heard something like that coming down, even from a voice of authority, the average person would say, well, I'm not doing that. But all you have to do is look at even relatively modern history and look at some of the things that, for example, Germany did under Hitler. Some of the things that he told those people to do, and by the time they got to the point where he was telling them to do those things, it made sense to them because they were so far invested in what he was doing. But take it a step further and realize that the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was God, or an incarnated version of God. So when God tells you to do something, it gets a lot easier to do it. So this is what Pharaoh has done, and so he has commanded a genocide at this point. So we're going to take a look in this setting, and we're going to take a look at three, I started to call it perspectives on motherhood. I think it's probably more accurate to call it three aspects of motherhood by taking a look at a few of the characters that we see in the story as we go along here. So we continue in Exodus chapter 2, and it says, now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. It's interesting to me that there's no mention of any names in this first part of the passage, but I'm assuming we all know who we're talking about, right? Who are we talking about? Moses, okay? Now, we also don't get the name of the woman. She's just the mother. Does anybody know the mother's name? Jochebed. Okay, you guys are good. Well done. Okay, so, all right, I'm impressed. Now, what's interesting, though, is do you notice that actually before this, the only names we got were the two midwives? They get names, but not his mother, not until later on, and just kind of in passing. Oh, by the way, but Jochebed is, of course, Moses' mother. And Jochebed stands for a principle of faith in motherhood, and faith more broadly, because Jochebed's idea to take her son, first of all, to hide him in defiance of the Pharaoh's orders, and then to put him into a basket and put him, it's kind of important. This is kind of like some of the other Bible stories where we read them, we don't really pay attention. It's not like you just put him in the Nile and he just goes she put him in the reed just so that he wouldn't go sailing off somewhere, so that somebody could at least keep an eye on him. We'll get to that in a minute here. And so that it was a situation where if he was going to survive, putting him out in the middle of the Nile would have been disastrous, and not the least of which because there are a lot of crocodiles in the Nile, and that would have been really bad too. So she has a plan here. It's not just, completely winging it, but one of the most basic principles that we have to understand when it comes to faith is that God, any plan that we're going to execute that's going to work is going to depend at least in part in faith on God. If our plan is all about how smart we are and all the things we can come up with, or how good we are, or whatever else is, it's going to fail. And Jochebed's plan is very much based in faith in God. Now, Jochebed, how do we know her name even? Well, over in Exodus chapter 6, we see when there is a recounting of the genealogy of Moses and his family, it mentions Moses' father, whose name is Amram. Amram married his father's sister Jochebed, and that sounds weird, but it's not as weird as it would be today. And she bore him Aaron and Moses. And the length of Amram's life was 137 years. So right there we see that Jochebed is Moses' mother, and that she has two sons, Aaron and Moses. Now Aaron is almost certainly significantly older than Moses, or at least somewhat older than Moses, because we know that he was an adult when Moses would come back to the land of Egypt, because he was going to help Moses speak. And yet he apparently was not born under the decree of execution, because if he had been, then presumably there would be at least a little bit of a story about, hiding him in the reeds or something like that. So more than likely, Aaron was significantly older than Moses. He may have already been working as a slave at that point, because that's what the Israelites are being made to do. But in any event, Aaron, Moses. In Numbers chapter 26, it gives us a little bit more information still, because it says the name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. She bore to Amram Aaron and Moses and their sister Miriam. So we get Miriam's name added in, and we also know that Miriam is a little older than Moses, and we'll get to why in just a second here. But what I want to kind of call out, and it's actually a very troubling and confusing fact, which is Jochebed's name actually means the glory of Yahweh. Now, if this was a class, I would ask you, but I'm a little concerned about, having that conversation and just trying to wing it here. So I'm just going to tell you that's kind of weird, because in the scriptures, the name Yahweh was revealed to who? Yeah, you got it. You're right, Moses. And it wasn't revealed to Moses until he was standing in front of the burning bush about 40 years after the passage that we're reading right here. So it raises a kind of weird question. Not weird, it raises a kind of troubling question. How does someone get the name, the glory of Yahweh, when the name Yahweh has never been mentioned before to anybody in the Bible? In fact, God even says to Moses, by my other name, by my title, God Almighty, which is El Shaddai, I was known to your forefather Abraham. But now I'm revealing myself to you as Yahweh. And there's some different speculations about this. Probably the most useful one is that even though God had not formally revealed himself in that way, that he had begun to reveal himself in that way, in some way. And so when he says to Moses, I'm Yahweh, he's confirming, or he is taking on that name in a way that he hadn't before. We don't exactly know why she would end up with a name that seems to reference a name of God that wasn't known yet. But it's interesting that she's given the name, the glory of Yahweh, or literally God's glory is actually her name. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so picking back up, we left off. So beautiful boy, execution order, let's see, hidden him for a while, got too loud and big and stuff like that. So makes a basket, covers it with tar and pitch. By the way, that good thing it didn't go into a fire, because that would have been a whole different kind of outcome to the story. Anyway, puts him in the Nile. Okay, so she put the child into the basket, set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister, this would be Miriam, but we're not using names yet in this passage. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to it. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. Now, this is interesting because it suggests that maybe Jochebed wasn't just winging it here. That maybe she had actually kind of planned this out some, knew where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. I mean, most of us, now granted, most of us have a shower, so we bathe in the same place every day, and we don't have to really wonder about that. But people are creatures of habit by and large. So maybe she had kind of observed that, and that's why she put him there. Because, I mean, if she needs somebody to find him, just sticking him out there and hoping things are going to work out isn't really a good way to go. So maybe she's actually scouted the location. Certainly she's created, and it's kind of a mystery box, If you think about this, you're going out of the Nile and there's a basket floating there. Human curiosity says, I want to know what's in the basket. I want to open that up. that always sometimes gets us into trouble as people, but in this case, it's working for her. So Jochebed has set up a situation where, or maybe anyway, has set up a situation where Pharaoh's daughter is naturally curious about what is happening, and she's kind of created, again, it doesn't guarantee everything's going to work out, but she's maximizing her opportunities. And here again, as people of faith, Paul says, make the most of every opportunity. He doesn't say have faith that God's just going to take everything and care of everything and just wander through life like you're oblivious to everything. It's make the best use of what's been put in front of you. Nevertheless, Jochebed has tremendous faith in God's providence because she's putting this baby in the Nile and she has no idea what's going to happen, whether it's going to be crocodiles or whether it's going to be a flood or whether it's just going to sit there and eventually she's going to have to go get him or something like that. God is going to have to step in to make this work, and she is willing to let go of her son to give him an opportunity to survive, which is really hard for us, just in general. And I can only imagine for parents and for mothers the difficulty that's involved in letting go of your children in order for them to grow and expand beyond what they can be when they're just under the nest and the wing and that sort of thing. And so Jochebed is willing to let her son go. And of course, we know it's going to work out pretty well because it says, when Pharaoh's daughter opened the box, or sorry, not the box, I'm using my own analogy here too much, opened the basket, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, as well one might understand, because have you ever been around, like, covered or right with tar and pitch all over, it stinks. You know, little babies, that's just, maybe the fumes are getting, whatever. So she had pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Which is interesting because she immediately recognized who he was, and also she has pity on him. She doesn't look at it and go, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Let's kill it. So then his sister, this is where things get, I think, really creative, because then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's mother, because she's not a moron, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. Now, how awesome is this? Because she's going to get paid to raise her kid. How many of you that are mothers would love to have gotten paid just to be mothers? Raise your hands. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands here. A couple of people didn't raise your hands, and I think you're lying. You need to repent. But anyway... So she gets paid to raise her son, but it's more than that. And we always, I'm not the first one to make that observation. She got paid to raise her kid. What I think is even more impressive, and I'm probably not the first person to make this observation either, I just haven't heard it myself before, is that because this is Pharaoh's daughter giving her her son, she is now under the protection of Pharaoh to raise that son. There's no danger to Moses from now on, no matter the fact that whatever the Pharaoh said, because the Pharaoh's daughter has said, this is my son. And so as she's raising Moses, she's the only Israelite woman who's raising a boy who doesn't have to worry about somebody coming along and finding that boy and killing him. And that's pretty awesome. Okay, it says the child grew. We're still not calling him by name. I love that. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses. And finally, we have a name besides the two midwives, and said, because I drew him out of the water. Which is an interesting way to name your kid, right? I got him out of the water, so that's his name, Moses. Okay. So in addition to the fact that Jochebed and this plan she has and the providence of God gets her the ability to get paid to raise her own son and protects him and stuff, think about who Jochebed becomes the mother of. It's not just Moses. It's Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Now Moses freed Israel from Egypt, led Israel for a long time, received the covenants from God, was one of the few people on earth to meet with God relatively face-to-face, although it was limited in certain ways than the way maybe Adam and Eve hadn't. He was the one, so most parents try really hard to get their kids to read the Bible. Moses wrote the Bible, or at least the first 5 books of it. More than, in terms of just like sheer volume, more than anybody else did. He wrote it. Which probably puts Moses, because of all the things that he did, in the top 5 greatest of all time characters in the Bible. It's hard to get an exact number, and certainly in terms of the influence that they've had on Christianity, on Judaism. You've got Jesus, you've got Paul, you've got Moses, Abraham, I'm not sure who, maybe David, but he's right up in there. This is her son, her youngest son, her older son. Aaron is selected to be God's mouthpiece because Moses is too worried about talking, and so God says, okay, we'll use Aaron because apparently Aaron talked better than Moses did. So he gets picked for that. Not only that, Aaron becomes the first high priest, the model for high priesthood under the Jewish system, and he becomes essentially kind of a co-leader with Moses. Now, Moses is number one, but I guess vice president. Something like that. But his role as high priest is distinct from Moses' role and is tremendously successful or is tremendously important, and it will continue long after his death. And we'll get to Miriam in a minute and what she did, but this is a pretty spectacular success story as a mother who doesn't actually get named in the story in which she's actually mentioned. So Jochebed and what she did in saving Moses, and whatever she had to do with raising her children, tremendously impacted the fate and direction of the Israelites, of the world, of us even today, because of the children that she raised. And her faith is a model for not just the faith of mothers, but for the faith of all of us. Hebrews chapter 10, the Hebrew writer says, "But my righteous one will live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." He's talking about a time of trial that the Hebrews are going to, or the people he's writing to, the Hebrew audience is going to be facing. And then he says this, and I love this. He says, "But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul." Faith is what preserves our souls individually. The faith that parents, mothers especially, transmit to their children is what helps to preserve both the mothers and their children and their families. And it makes a huge difference in the lives of their children and the people that their children will go on to influence as well. So she is our first example, this example of faith. The second person, and she's the only one that's a mother in the context of the story, in the literal sense of it. The second person is Pharaoh's daughter, who becomes a surrogate or adoptive mother. And in her case, she becomes a model of compassion. It's not too hard to figure out why, right? Because in the passage we looked at a minute ago, it says, "She came down to bathe in the Nile. Her maiden was walking along beside her, saw the basket among the reeds, sent her maid, brought it back to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. He's crying, and she had pity on him," or had compassion for him. Sometimes the term pity gets kind of a negative thing, especially when we think about it in terms of a pity party, like I got pity for myself. That's just weak. But pity for someone else is compassion, is recognizing hardship and suffering and having a desire to do something about it. Okay? So she sees the boy crying, and she says, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." But she still feels compassion for him. And rather than saying, "Okay, well, let's toss him in the river. Too bad for him. That's what my dad said to do." She knows he's a Hebrew, and presumably she's Pharaoh's daughter. Surely she knows that this child is supposed to die. Even if she's not willing to do it herself, she could have called the guard over or something, or had her maid do it. But that was what she was supposed to do according to the law of the land. But instead, she has compassion, and she adopts him instead. Now, it raises kind of an interesting question. How would she have felt? What would she have done if she'd known where this was going? Because maybe it would have had a very different outcome, because Moses is going to be the instrument of God in bringing Egypt to total ruin, basically. So I'm not sure she would have necessarily done that had she known everything that was going to happen, but that kind of speaks to the nature of our decision-making all the time, right? We have to make choices, and we don't always know exactly where those choices are going to lead, but if we are operating on faith and operating in God's way and operating with compassion and love and kindness, those things ultimately lead to the outcome that God wants, even if it isn't always exactly what we want. So she sees him. She knows he's a Hebrew. She feels compassion for him. And so Miriam comes and, with her clever proposal, you want me to go find somebody to raise the boy for you? Oh, yeah, that'd be great, So we see then, so Pharaoh's daughter says to Jochebed, "Take the child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." And the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew. She brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. She named him Moses. And he becomes a part of Pharaoh's household. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's important because he's protected. Now, he's not under threat of death. But also it's important because that means that Moses had probably gotten an education and a culturing that was vastly beyond most of the Israelites. And not just because they were slaves, but because the Israelite culture, not real advanced. Let's not lose sight of the fact that when God took them out of Egypt, he had to mention to them, "Hey, by the way, don't just go eating blood all the time." Most cultures, the Egyptians were like, "Yeah, we got that." But a lot of the stuff that God has to tell the Israelites, it's kind of the sort of thing that you'd have to tell a 4-year-old. And so their culture is not very advanced. Moses is probably going to be taught to write. He's going to be taught to read. He's going to be taught to speak. He's going to be taught all sorts of things that the rest of the Israelites aren't going to get. And that's really important because God is going to have a really useful tool by the time he's done educating him and experiencing those things when he sends him back into Egypt and when he has to organize and lead 1 million plus people for 40 years after that. These are not the sort of things that are easy to do. And so Moses gets the kind of education and upbringing that's going to make it easier for him to do that, all because he's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. So this is really, really significant. And of course, Moses is going to become the instrument of Egypt's destruction by God's hand, and I'm sure that's not what his adoptive mother would have wanted, but she becomes an instrument of God's providence because she shows him mercy. Again, maybe not the outcome she was expecting, but the scriptures teach us that, you know what, we don't always know the outcome of the choices we're making, but if we make the right choices, it's going to be a good outcome. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews 13 says, "Let love of the brethren continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it." So what we do, the kindnesses that we show, the compassion and generosity that we show, we don't always know what it's going to lead to, but it's God's will that we show that, and sometimes it leads to a lot more than we could ever expect. My guess would be that if you went through and asked every one of us, we could think of, if we put our heads to it, at least one example of our own life where we did something good for someone else and it turned into something much bigger and better than we ever would have expected. Well, mothers, more than anything, are doing those kinds of things for their children, and you don't always know what's going to happen. You don't always know, you never actually know exactly how it's going to turn out. But by doing those things, by showing love and showing compassion, you are having an impact on your children that is a powerful impact, and that down the road may produce fruit that you could never have expected. But it produces fruit. It produces something by what we do. And as Christians, more broadly, the things that we do, even if we don't see them in the moment, they produce fruit down the road as long as we are working within God's plan. We talked about this briefly during class. God says, or Paul actually says, that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. He doesn't say all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, and you can totally see what's happening the whole time. A lot of times it's that idea of you're doing what God wants. You are cooperating with God's will, and because of that, you are following the current of God's plan, and so good is going to come out of that, even if in the moment it isn't obvious what that good is. But by being part of that current of God's will, whether it's as mothers with children, or whether it's just as Christians in general, we are helping to carry out God's plan, and we are being blessed by God's plan as a result. So Pharaoh's daughter stands for this principle of compassion, even when we can't see why it's good for us. That's hard to get people to buy into that principle today. The first question almost anybody asks when you want them to do something for someone else is, what's in it for me? And a lot of times the answer is nothing. We just want you to be nice to people, and it's hard sometimes. So that's the second principle. The third person we're going to look at is Miriam. Miriam is obviously not Moses' mother. She's his sister. She's older. We don't know how much older. She may have been a little girl. She may have been, a young woman. It's hard to know for sure. But the principle, the value, the characteristic that I most associate with Miriam, there's a lot of different ways to say this, is audacity. You don't often see audacity in the list of Christian virtues, but stay with me. I'm going to give you an argument for why it should be there. Okay? So, going back to Exodus chapter 2, it says that Jochebed put the child into the basket, set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to it. And I think that it's funny. You ever thought about the fact that actually Moses is the one writing this down? That's kind of weird. You talk about in the third person. And my sister, his sister, stood at a distance to find out what would happen to it. I think Moses may have been sort of understanding that because it's pretty clear Miriam had a plan of some sort. That or she's super clever. But either way, she comes down, the daughter of Pharaoh, bathes in the Nile. Maiden sees the basket. Maiden brings it to her, opens the basket up, sees the child. Behold, the child is crying. She had pity on him. Now, that's a really necessary step. We've talked about why that's necessary. If she had compassion on him, everything else falls apart. But don't underestimate what Miriam does next, because his sister says to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Now, we think about this in the context of that it got Moses' mother the opportunity to raise her son, and that's totally important. But how many of you have ever wanted to do something nice for somebody, and then you realized how complicated it was going to be, and you thought, you know what, somebody else will do something nice? You know, there is a tendency sometimes, compassion is sometimes weighted with practicality. And so I think that probably what's the most clever about what Miriam is doing here isn't the fact that she's going to bring Moses' mother, it's that she's making it really easy for Pharaoh's daughter to do the right thing. So she says, let me go make this easy for you. Let me go get a person who can take care of this for you. You don't have to worry about it. And so Pharaoh's daughter, who already wants to do the right thing, is saying, okay, it's really going to be easy to do the right thing. Let's go and do the right thing. It gets a lot harder at that point to say, no, let's throw it in the water, because it's become so simple. And so Miriam's audacity in approaching, by the way, this is a Hebrew daughter, her Hebrew girl approaching the Pharaoh's daughter. That could be risky on a number of levels. She does this, she makes this proposal, and the result is that Pharaoh's daughter has an easy path to doing what she wants to do anyway, which is to preserve the boy's life. And so Pharaoh's daughter says, go ahead, and the girl went in, like I said, she's not an idiot. She goes and gets Jochebed and brings her back and says, here you go, I just happened to find this woman. Isn't she's really worked out really well, And so you can call it whatever you want. You can call it daring, audacity, boldness. Miriam takes a huge risk of exposure that could have led her to personal danger, and her quick thinking or plan or whatever you want to do, whatever you want to call it, reinforces Pharaoh's daughter's desire to be kind and show compassion, and provides an easy solution that's good for everyone. And so the result is that what Jochebed wants, what Miriam wants, what God wants, gets done because of Miriam's boldness. And Miriam is remembered, and she is significant in the ongoing leadership of Israel. As the Israelites are leaving Egypt, after the plague on the firstborn, after Pharaoh has ordered them to leave, Moses begins to lead them in a song of kind of rejoicing as they leave. It says in Exodus chapter 15, Moses and the sons of Israel, notice it says sons of Israel. So it's Moses and the dudes. They sing the song to the Lord, and he said, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. This is after they've crossed the Red Sea and the army of Egypt has been wiped out. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will extol him. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. It's actually much longer than I've kind of taken some stuff out because I want us to end in time to go to lunch. So then it says, though, Miriam the prophetess, by the way, she's been promoted. She's not just a little girl who tells Pharaoh's daughter that she can get a woman for. She's now a prophetess, which means she's getting direct revelation from God, or at least she's speaking on God's behalf. Aaron's sister, also Moses' sister, kind of odd that wasn't the one they chose to identify, took the timbrel in her hand. I don't know what a timbrel is exactly. People say it's like a... like a tambourine, but maybe, okay. So, but it says all the women went after her. So all the men have been singing. Now the women are going to be coming along with timbrels and with dancing. And Miriam answered them, not the women. Miriam answered the men, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea. This is basically a responsive singing, which might make Miriam the first worship leader in the entire Bible. Arguably anyway. So she's got this much. She will continue to be a voice of leadership. Now, she's going to overstep her bounds later on, and that's not so good. And so it's kind of important to remember that boldness needs to be tempered with, obedience. But still, she is going to be important in the leadership of Israel. And I want to make a point here, because even in our culture today, as much as we have tried to change, and in some ways maybe not so good ways, we have tried to change the roles between men and women, the reality is that there is a bad reputation that comes along with women who are bold or audacious. Men, we're bold. We are risk takers. Women are pushy. Women are nag. Women. It's the same feature a lot of times, but because of the expectation of gender roles, we don't appreciate it very much coming from women. But the truth is that I think at some point in their lives, every mom has to be bold, has to be audacious to get their children what they need. Nobody's kids are so perfect. Nobody's situation is so perfect that there are times where mom doesn't have to step up and say, okay, we're going to do something different. Okay, you need to know about this. That's a role that mothers have. That's a role that we all have as well as Christians. In 2 Timothy, Paul says to Timothy, who had a reputation apparently for timidity, is God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. Mothers and fathers too, but mothers, because they're in the home more often, have a big role in disciplining their children. And also, if you're going to be successful as a mother, you're going to have to have a role in disciplining yourself as well. Making good decisions and controlling your anger, because heaven knows those kids can really make you angry sometimes. I'm speaking from experience, not as a father, but as the kid who made people angry. Mothers have to have that patience, that ability to be under control. And the ability to have the willingness to step out and do bold things. And in Miriam's case, she is named in some pretty lofty company. In Micah chapter 6, God is talking to Israel, and this is, of course, by the time that Israel has rebelled against him multiple times, and he says, "My people, what have I done to you, and how have I wearied you? Answer me. Indeed, I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and I ransomed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam." She's listed among the leaders of Israel coming up out of Egypt and during that time that they are going into the promised land. And so Miriam's role becomes significant. And I think here again, all of us can look back at our mothers and find ways in which their influence on our lives was significant or enormous, depending on how far you want to go with your adjectives and superlatives. So the reality is that if you are a mother and you have raised children, you are in good company with people who've done some really, really hard work throughout history. And the reality is that any mother who really has done the role of mother at some point, if they've been a Christian mother, has shown faith and compassion and even a little bit of audacity in order to raise their children and have the kind of impacts they need. And we see these principles coming together in Colossians chapter 3. And this is the end. This is the last passage. Colossians chapter 3, Paul says, "So, as those who have been chosen of God," and there's that faith thing, because you don't get chosen by God just at random. God chooses people who have faith, just like Jochebed did. "Those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." And there's the Pharaoh's daughter and her response to Moses, "Bearing with one another and forgiving each other, whoever has complained against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." You're thinking, where did we miss audacity at? There was supposed to be audacity in there. Let me tell you something. Loving people, forgiving people, takes a huge amount of boldness, a huge amount of courage. Because when you love people, when you forgive people, and when people start to realize that you love them and that you will forgive them, there is a tremendous potential for you getting hurt. It's true for mothers. It's true for every single one of us. It takes an enormous amount of boldness to love the way God wants us to love the way Christ loved us and sacrificed himself for us, because Christian love, motherly love, is sacrificial. And sacrifice takes courage. The theories about where Jochebed's name comes from, there's a lot of them. My favorite one, my personal favorite one, is maybe the reason that at the beginning of Exodus, we don't hear her name is because that wasn't originally her name. It wouldn't be unheard of. Abraham, Paul, Peter, all of them got named after the fact because of what they did and who they were. And I wonder if Jochebed's name didn't come about after the fact, that she wasn't given the name, the glory of God, not because she was born with that name, because boy, that's a big name to put on some little kid. But because after the fact, her son, who became the most significant leader in Israel's history, said, "You know what? This is a better name than whatever that was before. This is the really appropriate name." And presumably then, with the guidance of God, calling her not whatever her name might have been before, but rather the glory of God. Because what she did started a process that resulted in the liberation of Israel, the first of the great covenants, well, second of the great covenants between God and man, and this foundation of the principles that would ultimately lead to the Savior of mankind. And the sacrifice that he would make, and the significance of that sacrifice that Steve explained so well to us earlier, all of that begins, at least in part, or is a fulcrum point of Jochebed's decisions about what to do with her son. And so today we celebrate mothers. And we celebrate those who serve in roles that are motherhood adjacent, as it were. Maybe they don't have their own kids, but have done things to influence the direction and course of history and of people's lives because of the sacrifices they've made, because of the love that they've shown, and because of the courage that they've had. The thing I want to say to all of us is that even though half of us in here, roughly, are never going to be mothers, because either we're too old for it or because, well, mainly because we're all dudes. The reality is that all of us are called to those kind of characteristics. All of us are called to have that kind of impact on history. Whether it's tiny or big, all of us have a role in showing faith and compassion and audacity as Christians. Let's stand and sing.